Good. So the contrast between quantitative and qualitative research has been very prominent already in my presentation of data collection methods, but let's look systematically at how quantitative and qualitative research methods differ. First of all, they differ in their function. They have a prioritized statement type, where quantitative research wants to talk about typicality and distributions. Qualitative research more emphasizes statements about existence, that there is a phenomenon called XY, or that we want to call XY, or patterns. So it will be easier to spot patterns or make a case for the existence of something, even if you analyze a relatively low number of cases and don't know about their representativeness for a universe. That is not necessary if you just want to say this is a thing and there seems to be a pattern that looks like this. Right? Then it's up to quantitative scholars to see how typical is that and how is it distributed. In terms of function, they also differ in their theoretical contribution, where quantitative approaches would focus on falsifying, revising, and developing theory. Qualitative approaches would emphasize building theory, expanding theory beyond what we already have probed, showing complications, and providing contextualizations. So that's just very different missions they take, and therefore they also use different kinds of data and approaches. Finally, the focus of interest in quantitative studies typically is on variables, things we can observe in units that we want to explain, whereas qualitative interest can also be on variables, but is more case-centric. We want to understand certain meaningful, analytically complete cases that we want to talk about, not the specific variables and measurements so much. Okay. Then we have differences in sampling, where we have the typical number of cases or units as high N studies in quantitative, whereas it tends towards low N in qualitative study. And here it's mostly about cases, and here it's about units that can be associated with a low N of cases as well. So if I compare public opinion on smoking in 2 countries, I seem to have a high N in the units, but I have a low N on the cases. That doesn't make it a qualitative study. And the sampling or case selection strategy would be on structure retaining samples, microcosm samples in quantitative studies, and purposive case selection, more or less, in qualitative research. They also differ in their views on measurement instruments. Instrument flexibility is very low in quantitative study. It's very fixed and rigid how we measure things, whereas qualitative research would want to be flexible in their instrumentation. They want to adapt to the individual case, that it's captured in a case-appropriate manner. Whereas in a quantitative study, the comparability between the cases is more important than being adequate to each and every single case or unit. Instrument development in quantitative studies will always take place before field work. It's too late when you want to go to the field and then need to create a questionnaire. That needs to be the same for everyone. In qualitative studies, we can have some preliminary measurement instrument already before field work, but we can adapt it during field work, because comparability between the units isn't important, because we can't compare them really in this microcosm way anyway. They aren't a sample of a fixed population that would allow some statistical generalization. That's just not a thing. Therefore, we can also adapt the instrument if it proves suboptimal during field work. And fieldwork can stretch much longer, possibly. They also differ in their description approach, whereas in quantitative research it's very variable based and rigid. The focus in qualitative studies is on being exhaustive and flexible. There's nothing wrong with introducing new dimensions of description in a certain case that you haven't applied to the other cases if it's only significant for that case, whereas the procedure would need to be the same and comparable across units in the quantitative framework. Finally, or almost finally, we have procedural differences, where there's a different treatment of the trade-off between structure and openness. So that's again the flexibility. Structure and rules are prioritized in the quantitative world, whereas open-endedness and flexibility is prioritized in the qualitative world. Data gathering and analysis are linear in quantitative study. First you gather your data and then you analyze it, whereas there can be loops in qualitative data, where you gather some data, do a preliminary analysis, gather some more data, analyze again, gather some more, and so on. The subjectivity of your sources or of your units or cases is treated very differently. In quantitative research, you want to minimize that, push that to a minimum, whereas it's cherished and even an object of study in the qualitative approach. Also, the treatment of the subjectivity of the researcher should be minimized in the quantitative framework. It shouldn't affect the structures and rules that you pick, right? It should be fair and fitting to all kinds of units. Whereas its subjectivity of the researcher is viewed as totally unavoidable in a qualitative setting, and the approach is more to make it transparent, to deal with it, to make it a theme of your analysis as well, and allow readers to consider it and view things from different perspectives. And finally, there's analytical differences. Data are being represented numerically in quantitative data and in varied ways in qualitative data, mostly in textual or descriptive ways. That means statistical analysis is an optimization criterion only in quantitative studies, whereas this plays no or little role in qualitative studies, which doesn't necessarily mean you can't use any statistical methods on those data, but the way you can do it is very limited, and statistical inferences on a population behind your results is usually not possible because of the way you pick the purposive way you pick your units, the relatively low number of units, and the too flexible and open-ended and looped instrumentation. Yes. Final thoughts on quantitative versus qualitative methodology is to view them against the background of the maturation of a research field and the necessary rigidity of testing certain theoretical components in that research field. So if you think of a research field that has a very low degree of maturation, it's brand new, a phenomenon we haven't seen before, that we need to get to grips with first. Then we are in the stage of where the main focus of research is open-ended exploration. We can basically only use qualitative strategies because we know too little about the phenomenon to even create a standardized questionnaire or a standardized codebook or observation schedule. Designs would usually be non-experimental, so you would go into the situation and look to identify relevant variables, exhaust concepts, contextualize, reconstruct subjective experience, interpretations, and sense making, and those would give you concepts and ideas for patterns that might motivate a more closed-ended exploration in the next step. So think of a research field that has a moderate degree of maturation. It is still under-researched, but we can do some more closed-ended explorations because we already have some working conceptualizations there that have proven their value. We know some patterns that exist or that others have found already and that are meaningful to the phenomenon we want to explain. Here we can first also use quantitative approaches, but the focus is probably still on qualitative. There is still too little insight to really work well with an experimental design, because there you need to know exactly which variables go with which and where you expect a causal relationship to be. At this stage, our purpose is to discover these patterns, build typologies, and explore the real-world relevance of some concepts and patterns that we see. Then, if that stage is settled, we have a relatively high degree of maturation of the research field. We know lots of factors that matter and have some idea of how they are connected. We go more into the quantitative direction. Now we want to explore which relationships are really substantial. Sometimes you may even go for experimental evidence at this stage and really probe for one plausible independent variable, whether it has a causal impact on the phenomenon. But mostly you want to explore correlations, develop predictions, map variables to dimensions, so get the measurement instrumentation straight and how you treat these variables and measurements, how to group cases to larger clusters that are meaningfully similar, validate your measurement instruments, again check real-world relevance, and test for intervening third variables. And only in this very late stage, where the research field is very mature, you have a lot of research attention, either because there's a lot of research recently or it has been around for a long time. Then you can go for rigid testing of specific relationships. There you have little alternative than to go quantitative. And you have strong incentive to go experimental in your study. And then you want to really test predictions, tap causality, test for intervening variables, and validate measurement instruments. Okay, so as a summary, this means that quantitative and qualitative research aren't really alternatives to pick from, and one is somehow better than the other, but they have different functions that play out their strength, particularly in certain stages of the maturation of a research field. And that doesn't mean that you can't come in at this very high maturity research field and then do a very open-ended exploration type study that challenges some of these things and provokes a discussion and then starts some of the movement again along this, because you discover a case that just doesn't fit. All the rigid testing has been done on a specific kind of case, and now you have a different case and you find something different, or you raise some conceptual questions that have been taken for granted among those who do the rigid testing. So it doesn't mean that here you can't do any qualitative research anymore, but just the maturation of the research field now calls for is more or less this setup, and everything else is good to bring it back to one of these earlier stages and say, no, we have to go back and consider some other explanation on top or in addition, particularly if here something doesn't make sense or is fishy. Good.